The Unseen Road. George Thompson was a man who found peace in solitude. At 45, with a chiseled build that came from years of working with his hands, he had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of rural life. A black man with a deep love for the outdoors, George thrived in the tranquility of nature. He had always found solace in the simple things: the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, the rustling of the wind through tall grass, and the sight of a sprawling landscape under the golden glow of the setting sun. On this particular day, George was behind the wheel of his well-worn, silver truck. He had the windows rolled down, the soft hum of the engine blending with the gentle rustling of the trees lining the road. A warm summer breeze flowed through the open windows, carrying with it the earthy scent of fresh grass, wildflowers, and the distant scent of rain that hung in the air, teasing the horizon with the promise of an approaching storm. His fingers rested comfortably on the steering wheel, guiding the truck down the winding country road that he had driven countless times before. The radio played a soft melody that seemed to match his mood perfectly, a classic tune that reminded him of summer nights spent on the porch of his childhood home. He hummed along to the song, lost in the music, his mind drifting toward the upcoming wedding of his best friend, Ray. Ray had been like a brother to him, and George was honored to be his best man. The two had grown up together, shared their dreams, their struggles, and their triumphs. Ray had always been the one with big ideas, the one who dreamt of a future that felt just out of reach. George, on the other hand, had always been more grounded, the steady hand that helped bring those dreams to life. As he drove, George couldn't help but smile to himself. He had worked hard to get to where he was, and seeing Ray about to marry the love of his life made him feel a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. His best friend was about to embark on a new chapter, and George would be right there by his side, as he always had been. The road stretched out before him like a ribbon of possibility, winding through hills that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of the earth itself. The landscape was breathtaking, lush green fields dotted with wildflowers, the occasional farmhouse in the distance, and towering oak trees that seemed to stand guard over the land. The warm sun bathed everything in golden light, casting long shadows that danced across the road. It was the kind of view that made you feel as though the world was pausing for a moment, just to let you appreciate its beauty. But as George drove on, a strange sensation began to creep over him. It was subtle at first, a vague unease that he couldn't quite place. The scenery, which had once been so familiar, was starting to look different. The hills seemed steeper, the trees fewer and farther apart. A nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach told him something wasn't quite right. He glanced at the road signs, but none of them seemed familiar. He furrowed his brow and checked his watch. The time seemed to have passed faster than he expected. He had been driving for almost an hour, but it was hard to tell exactly where he was. The winding road had lulled him into a sense of comfort, and now he realized that he had lost track of his surroundings. Had he missed a turn? Was he heading in the wrong direction? He slowed down and looked around, hoping to spot a sign or a landmark that would help him get his bearings. But all he saw was more of the same, endless stretches of green fields and rolling hills. The houses were few and far between, and the ones he did pass were weathered and seemed as though they had been standing there for generations. The landscape felt like something out of another time, far removed from the busy world he had come from. George let out a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Better safe than sorry, he muttered to himself, deciding to pull over and check his phone for directions. As he eased the truck to the side of the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He reached for his phone, which was sitting on the passenger seat, and unlocked it. But before he could even tap the screen, a sudden flash of red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The sight of the police car caused a jolt of panic to surge through his chest. His grip on the steering wheel tightened instinctively, his heart rate spiking as he glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. The flashing lights seemed to grow brighter, the siren blaring louder. George's mind raced with questions. What was going on? Why were they pulling him over? He glanced around. The road was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. The police car was closing in fast, and George's unease grew with each passing second. He had done nothing wrong, had he? His mind raced as he tried to think back over the past few hours. There had been nothing unusual, no speeding, no reckless driving, nothing that would have attracted attention. The police car came to a stop behind him, and George reluctantly rolled down his window, his palms now sweaty. The officer who approached his truck was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the stern expression of someone who had seen far too much. He had the look of someone used to giving orders, someone who expected to be obeyed without question. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone sharp and no-nonsense. George's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly composed himself. "Of course," he replied, his voice calm but his mind still racing. His hand went to the glove compartment, retrieving his license and registration, which he handed over to the officer without hesitation. "Is there a problem, officer?" George asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the nerves beginning to bubble up inside him. The officer didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the documents carefully. He took a moment longer than usual, before looking up and giving George an unreadable glance. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer said. His voice was now colder, more forceful. George's stomach dropped. "Is there a reason for this?" George asked, feeling the rising tide of panic in his chest. He glanced around once more, hoping to find something, anything, that would make sense of the situation. But there was nothing. Just the winding road, the towering trees, and the unsettling feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Step out of the vehicle, now," the officer repeated, this time with more authority. George knew better than to argue. He opened the door and slowly got out, his legs feeling heavy as he stood face to face with the officer, who was now joined by another cop, his partner. "Do you know why we pulled you over?" the second officer asked, his tone just as businesslike. "I'm not sure, officer," George answered, still trying to wrap his mind around what was happening. "I haven't done anything wrong." The two officers exchanged a quick glance, and George's heart raced even faster. What could this possibly be about? Was it a routine check? Or had he somehow become part of something much bigger than himself? Before George could ask another question, the first officer's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're under arrest." The arrest. The words hit George like a freight train. "You're under arrest." The officer's voice, cold and unwavering, echoed in his mind as the world around him seemed to come to a sudden halt. He stood there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Arrested? For what? He couldn't understand it. He had been driving down a peaceful country road, humming to the radio, lost in thought about his best friend's wedding. How could he possibly be under arrest? His hands, which had once rested comfortably on the steering wheel, now trembled slightly as the officer grabbed his arm and guided him toward the back of the patrol car. George opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. This couldn't be real. He couldn't be arrested. Not for something he hadn't done. His mind raced as the officer, his grip firm but not rough, directed him to stand by the car. The second officer began speaking into a radio, his voice low but urgent. "We have the suspect in custody. Requesting backup for processing." The cold, mechanical tone of the officer's voice sent a chill down George's spine. This was serious, and for reasons he couldn't fathom, he was now part of it. "Is this a mistake?" George finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at the officer who had just read him his rights, the same one who had given the arrest order. But the officer's face remained impassive, his expression unreadable. "We'll sort it out when we get to the station," the officer replied, not giving any further explanation. The words hung in the air like a promise he wasn't sure he could trust. George tried to calm himself, but the gnawing feeling in his gut grew stronger. He had never been in trouble with the law before, never so much as gotten a speeding ticket. So why, all of a sudden, was he being treated like a criminal? He had nothing to hide. Nothing in his life had ever warranted this kind of attention. As the officers guided him to the back of the patrol car, George's mind began to work overtime. Could this have something to do with the wedding? Was someone out to get him? Or was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? He didn't know, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being caught up in something much larger than he could comprehend. The car door slammed shut with a force that echoed in the quiet of the countryside, and George felt the world shift around him. He sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out the window as the road seemed to blur by. The occasional tree or farmhouse flashed past, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The world that had once felt so safe and predictable now seemed foreign, as if he had stumbled into a nightmare he couldn't escape. The ride to the station felt like an eternity. The silence between the officers and George was suffocating. The rhythmic sound of the car tires on the road, the distant chirping of crickets, and the low hum of the engine were the only sounds that filled the air. Each passing minute made George feel more and more like an outsider in his own life, as if he had somehow been cast adrift in a sea of uncertainty. When they finally arrived at the station, George was led inside and quickly processed. His hands were cuffed tightly behind his back, and he couldn't help but wince at the discomfort. The cold metal felt foreign against his skin, a stark reminder that things had taken an irreversible turn. "Have a seat," one of the officers told him, gesturing to a bench in the holding area. He obeyed, sitting down slowly, his mind still struggling to catch up with the events of the past hour. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow on the concrete walls. The station felt like a place designed to strip away any sense of comfort or familiarity, and the longer George sat there, the more out of place he felt. The minutes stretched on endlessly. George sat with his head hung low, his thoughts racing. He could hear the muffled voices of other officers in the distance, but none of them paid him any attention. He was just another name on a list, another person being processed through the system. But this wasn't supposed to be his reality. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a man, driving to his best friend's wedding, trying to enjoy a peaceful afternoon. At one point, an officer came over and told him they needed to take his fingerprints. George complied silently, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had been fingerprinted before for things like background checks, but this felt different. The cold, impersonal touch of the scanner, the sharp click of the machine as it recorded his prints, it all felt like an assault on his very identity. "Relax," the officer said, sensing George's tension. "It's just procedure." But George wasn't sure what he could possibly do to relax. He had been pulled into a system he didn't understand, accused of a crime he couldn't even begin to fathom. The hours began to blend together, and soon, a detective named Harris arrived. His suit was sharp, his expression businesslike. He approached George with the air of a man who had seen it all. George tried to read his face, searching for any hint of sympathy, but the detective's eyes were unreadable. "George Thompson," Detective Harris said, as if tasting the name on his tongue. "You've been accused of a serious crime. Do you have any idea why you're here?" George's heart sank. A crime? The detective's words sent a fresh wave of panic through him. What crime could they possibly be talking about? George had never been in trouble before, he had worked hard his entire life, kept his nose clean, stayed out of the spotlight. He had no enemies. No one had any reason to accuse him of anything. "I don't know what's going on," George replied, his voice shaky. "I haven't done anything wrong." Harris didn't respond immediately. He studied George for a moment, then looked down at the file in his hand. "This is going to sound strange, Mr. Thompson, but we've got reason to believe you're connected to a crime. A serious one." George felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. His mind reeled, struggling to grasp what the detective was saying. He opened his mouth to argue, to deny everything, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? How could he explain himself when he had no idea what was going on? "We need to run a few more checks," Harris continued. "Just to confirm a few things." George wanted to shout, wanted to demand that they let him go, but instead, he found himself sitting there, helpless, as the detective left the room. He could feel the weight of the accusation hanging over him like a shadow. The walls of the holding cell seemed to close in around him, and for the first time, George truly felt what it was like to be a suspect. As the hours dragged on, George's thoughts raced. How had he gotten here? What had he done to deserve this? And more importantly, who was out there who had wanted to make him the fall guy for something he had no part in? The revelation. The fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly, casting a cold, sterile glow over the small interrogation room. George sat at the worn, metal table, his hands still cuffed in front of him. The weight of the cold steel seemed to press against his chest as he sat there, mind racing, heart pounding. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. He could hear the distant murmur of voices echoing through the concrete walls, but they sounded far away, faint whispers in a world that was quickly losing its sense of normalcy. Detective Harris had left him alone in the room with nothing but his thoughts. Every time the door opened, George's heart skipped a beat, but it was always just another officer passing by, walking with a sense of urgency that didn't even seem to notice him. His own mind was a blur of confusion and frustration. What had he done wrong? How had things escalated so quickly? The events that had unfolded in the past few hours felt like they were happening to someone else. One minute, George had been cruising along a quiet country road, looking forward to his best friend's wedding. Now, here he was, shackled in a cold, sterile room, accused of a crime he had no connection to. Nothing made sense. The door to the room creaked open again, and this time, it was Detective Harris who walked in, followed by another man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure wearing a suit that looked far too expensive for a small-town police station. George didn't know who he was, but something about the man's presence sent a ripple of unease through him. "Mr. Thompson," Harris said, his voice tight, "this is Special Agent Scott. He's here to help with the investigation." George's eyes flicked between the two men, trying to gauge their intentions. Special Agent? Who was this guy? What investigation was this really about? It seemed as if this case was growing deeper, more complicated, by the minute. Agent Scott didn't immediately speak. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down across from George, his dark eyes scanning George with an intensity that made him feel exposed. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. George shifted in his seat, trying to read the agent's expression, but the man's face was as implacable as stone. "Do you know why you're here?" Agent Scott asked, his voice calm but measured. George shook his head slowly, still trying to piece together the fragments of the last few hours. "I was just driving to my friend's wedding. I don't know what's going on. I haven't done anything wrong. I swear." Harris, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up, his voice sharper. "It's not that simple, Mr. Thompson. We have reason to believe you're connected to a high-level criminal operation. A series of unsolved robberies, including one that just occurred in the nearby town. You were seen in the area, and we have reason to suspect you might be involved." George's heart raced, the words crashing through him like a tidal wave. Robberies? What the hell was he being accused of? He was just a man trying to make it to his best friend's wedding. He had no involvement in any crime, let alone something as serious as robbery. He had worked hard all his life, kept his head down, stayed out of trouble. This had to be a mistake. "I don't know what you're talking about," George said, his voice low but firm. "I didn't rob anyone. I've never been involved in anything like that." Agent Scott's eyes didn't waver. He simply watched George for a long moment, as if weighing his words. The silence grew heavy, pressing down on George's shoulders. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the suspicion in the air, and it made his stomach churn. "We're not accusing you of being a criminal," Scott said, finally breaking the silence. "At least, not yet. But you're connected to this in ways we don't fully understand. Your presence at the scene of these robberies, your connections to people involved in this case, there's too much coincidence for this to be ignored." George's mind reeled. Connections? Presence? What was Scott talking about? He didn't have any connections to criminals. He had no history with robberies. There had to be some kind of mistake, some mix-up with another person. He tried to speak, to explain himself, but the words were stuck in his throat. "Let's back up for a moment," Scott continued, leaning forward slightly. "I need to ask you a few questions, George. Simple ones. Answer honestly, and this will go easier for you." George nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "Okay," he replied, his voice hoarse. Scott folded his hands on the table, his gaze never leaving George's face. "Where are you from, George? Where did you grow up?" George felt a pang of confusion, but he answered, "I grew up in a small town outside of Denver. My family's been there for generations." Scott nodded, then asked, "What do you do for a living?" "I'm a contractor," George replied, his brows furrowing. "I build houses, do some landscaping work. I've been in the business for over 20 years. Scott's lips twitched slightly, but it wasn't a smile. "What about your father, George? What did he do?" George's heart skipped a beat. "My father, he was in the military. He served in the army. He passed away a few years ago." There was a flicker of something in Scott's eyes, something that seemed to change. The agent leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "And your mother? What does she do?" George shifted uncomfortably. "She's retired. She worked as a teacher for most of her life." Scott's gaze sharpened, as if looking for something deeper. "I see. And what about your background in law enforcement? Any connections to that?" George's confusion deepened. "Law enforcement? No. I don't have any background in law enforcement. I'm not connected to anyone in that field, if that's what you're asking." The silence between them grew longer, thick with unspoken tension. Scott's eyes were hard, calculating, as if everything George said was being meticulously analyzed. George's mind raced, trying to figure out where this line of questioning was leading. Then, just as suddenly, the air in the room shifted. Scott's eyes widened for a brief moment, and then he exchanged a look with Detective Harris. George watched them closely, his stomach twisting in knots. "We've just received new information, George," Scott said, his voice a little softer now, though still sharp. "It seems there's more to your story than we originally thought." George's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What information?" The two men exchanged another glance, and then Harris spoke. "It appears there's something about your father's past that's very relevant to this case. Something we didn't know before. Your family's history is much deeper than you realize." George's chest tightened as confusion and fear gripped him. What could they possibly be talking about? His father had been a respected military man, someone who had served his country with pride. What could they know that he didn't? "Your father, George," Harris said, leaning in slightly, "he was involved in a covert operation. An operation that links back to a criminal syndicate. A group that's been involved in international smuggling and high-profile heists for decades." The words felt like a punch to the gut. George's mind raced. His father? A criminal? It didn't make sense. His father had been a hero in George's eyes, a man of honor. How could this be true? "You're lying," George breathed, his voice barely audible, but filled with disbelief. "You're lying about my father. He was a good man. This can't be. Look at the evidence, George, Scott said quietly, his voice almost sympathetic. Your father's connections run deep, and they're tied to this criminal organization. And somehow, you're tied to it, too. The room seemed to spin around George as his world shattered. The one person he had always trusted, the one man he had looked up to his entire life, had secrets that were now coming to light, secrets that tied him to an underworld George had never known. Your father's past is why you're here, Scott continued, his voice steady now. And the sooner you come to terms with that, the sooner we can start unraveling the truth. George felt a rush of emotions, anger, confusion, disbelief. But amidst all of it, one question kept pounding in his head: how could everything he thought he knew about his family, his life, and himself be turned upside down so quickly? The burden of truth. The cold steel of the chair seemed to dig into George's legs as he sat there, barely able to process the staggering information that had just been dropped on him. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and something much darker, anger. His father, the man he had always admired, the man whose principles had shaped him, was suddenly part of something he could never have imagined. A covert operation? A criminal syndicate? This wasn't possible. His father had been a hero. How could everything George knew about his family and his identity be turned upside down in an instant? Detective Harris and Special Agent Scott stood at opposite ends of the room, silent now, watching George with a mixture of expectation and quiet patience. They knew that the truth had hit him hard. This wasn't just a case anymore, this was personal, and George was caught in the middle of it. His father's secrets had become his own, whether he liked it or not. How could you believe this? George asked, his voice shaking with emotion. His mind was racing, looking for some kind of logical explanation, something that would make sense of this nightmare. You're telling me my father, he was part of some criminal organization? Scott stepped forward, his gaze intense and unwavering. It's not what you think, George. Your father was a good man, but he was also a soldier in a world that required sacrifices. There are things he did in the name of national security, things that, in the end, got tangled up in forces far beyond his control. National security? George spat the words, bitterness lacing his tone. You're telling me that's why my father lied to me? Why he kept secrets from his own family? Because of some greater good? Sometimes, people make choices that seem right at the time, but the consequences, Scott began, but George cut him off. No, George said, his voice louder now, frustration spilling over. There's no excuse for this. He lied. He hid this from me. All my life, I thought I knew who he was. Now you're telling me that I didn't know a damn thing. Harris stepped in, his tone softer now, though still firm. We're not trying to attack your father's memory, George. What we're telling you is that there's a network, and your father's role in it was far more complex than you realize. That network is the one that's behind the robberies we've been investigating. And that's why you're involved. George shook his head, his hands gripping the edge of the metal table. How am I involved? I'm just a contractor. I build houses. I've never been involved in anything like this. I don't know any criminals. I've spent my life trying to do the right thing, trying to stay away from all of this. We know, Harris said. But your connection to the syndicate goes deeper than just your father. You're linked to people in that world, and right now, we don't know if you're a victim or a player. George felt like he was suffocating. Every breath he took seemed to push him further into the corner. He tried to steady his mind, to make sense of the madness surrounding him, but it was like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. His father's secret life was now his own burden, and there was no escaping it. Scott continued, his voice calm but firm. Your father was part of an operation in the late 1990s. It was classified, top secret. A covert mission involving smuggling and the transfer of military-grade weapons. The operation was intended to prevent global conflicts, but somewhere along the way, things went off track. The people he worked with started using the operation for personal gain, smuggling goods, laundering money, and pulling off high-stakes heists. It was a tangled mess. George's stomach churned. It was almost impossible to comprehend. His father, someone who had always preached integrity, was now linked to criminal activity on an international scale. The idea made George's head spin. But that doesn't make any sense. If my father was involved, why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he come clean? Because it's complicated, Scott said. And when the operation went sideways, your father became a target. He went underground for years, trying to protect your family and keep you out of it. But the people he worked with, they don't forget. And now, they're circling back. They want something from you, George. From me? George asked, his voice rising. What could they possibly want from me? I'm just a regular guy. I don't have anything of value. I don't know what they're talking about. Harris looked at him with a mixture of pity and determination. They think you do. They think you've inherited something your father left behind. And now, you're caught in the middle of this mess. George ran his hands through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. His father had spent his entire life protecting George from this world, from the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their quiet life. But now, that darkness had come crashing in, and there was no running from it. The past had caught up to him, and George had no idea how to face it. The door to the interrogation room opened suddenly, and another officer entered, looking frantic. Detective Harris, Agent Scott, we've got something. You need to see this. Harris and Scott exchanged a glance before nodding. Excuse us for a moment, Harris said, before walking out of the room, leaving George alone with his thoughts. The seconds felt like hours as George sat there, trying to process what had just been said. His head was pounding, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions and fears. What had his father been involved in? What did they think George knew? What was it that they wanted from him? He stood up abruptly, his legs stiff from sitting for so long, and paced the small room. His mind was running in circles, trying to find a way out of this, trying to figure out how to clear his name, to get out of the mess his father had left behind. But there were no answers, just more questions. And with each passing second, George felt the walls of this strange, terrifying world close in on him more and more. The door opened again, and Detective Harris and Special Agent Scott walked back in, their expression serious. There was a new weight in the air, a palpable tension that made George's heart race even faster. We've got a lead, Scott said, his voice tight. We need to move quickly. There's more going on here than we thought. George's pulse quickened. What do you mean? We think your father left behind something valuable, Harris explained, his eyes intense. And whoever is behind this is willing to do anything to get it. They know you're the key, George. It's time we figure out what your father left behind and what role you have to play in all of this. George felt like he had just been punched in the gut. His father had left behind something valuable? What could it possibly be? And how had he, George, become the one to bear the weight of it? I don't know what you're talking about, George said, the desperation in his voice unmistakable. I don't know anything about anything. I'm just a guy trying to get to a wedding. Harris gave him a look that was half sympathy, half resolve. You may be just a guy, George. But you're now part of something far bigger than you ever realized. Unraveling the past. George sat in the interrogation room, his mind a chaotic swirl of disbelief and mounting fear. Every new piece of information that had come to light felt like another weight pressing down on him. His father's past, the secret life he had hidden for so long, was now crashing into George's reality. The truth was no longer a distant concept, it was raw, visceral, and threatening to unravel everything George had ever known about his family, his life, and himself. The door to the room opened again, but this time, it wasn't Detective Harris or Special Agent Scott who entered. A young officer stepped inside, holding a thin manila envelope, his expression serious. George stood up, his heart skipping a beat. Something told him this wasn't just another update, it was something more. "Mr. Thompson," the officer said, his voice hesitant, "we need you to take a look at this. It's from your father's records." George's stomach dropped. His father's records? What could that possibly mean? He took the envelope from the officer, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was thick, filled with papers that felt too important, too personal. George had no idea what to expect. Was it a letter? A message from his father? Was there something hidden in those pages that would explain everything? He tore the envelope open with trembling hands and pulled out the contents. His eyes scanned the first few pages, and immediately, the words blurred together. The documents weren't just records, they were encrypted files, names and dates, numbers that meant nothing to him. But one thing stood out, a symbol, something he recognized, a logo his father had worn on his military uniform all those years ago. It was a faded emblem, two intertwined serpents, their bodies coiling in opposite directions, each biting the other's tail. Beneath the symbol was a cryptic set of numbers and letters, all in a code that made George's head spin. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no turning back now. This wasn't just a mistake anymore, this was real. His father had been part of something far darker and more dangerous than George had ever imagined. Where did this come from? George asked, his voice hoarse. What is this? Why is it in my father's records? The officer didn't answer right away. He looked uncomfortable, as if he didn't fully understand what he was giving George either. We found this hidden in a safe deposit box under your father's name. It's one of the things we were looking for, something that could connect your father to the criminal network we've been tracking. The symbol is a key part of the organization's history. We don't know everything about it yet, but we're working on decoding it. George's mind was spinning. This wasn't just a random document, it was a direct link to something his father had been involved in. His hand trembled as he held the papers, but he quickly collected himself. If there was any chance to understand the truth, he had to keep his head together. What's the connection between this symbol and the syndicate? George asked, his voice tight. The officer hesitated before answering. We don't know yet. But the symbol has been seen in several high-profile operations. We think it's tied to a series of crimes, smuggling, arms dealing, and even political manipulation. Your father was deeply involved in the early stages of this network, but we believe he walked away before it became too dangerous. And now it looks like someone is trying to finish what he started. George clenched his fists, his body taut with a mixture of anger and fear. His father hadn't just been part of a secret military operation, he had been involved in something far more insidious. The past he had tried so hard to bury, the legacy he had tried to protect George from, was now chasing them both down. The weight of it was suffocating. The officer cleared his throat. There's one more thing, Mr. Thompson. We found something else. In your father's last known safe house, we discovered a series of maps, coordinates, and a list of names. Some of those names match known associates of the criminal syndicate. We think your father hid something of incredible value. The syndicate wants it. And we believe you might be the key to finding it. George's eyes widened in disbelief. You're saying my father left something behind? Something that's worth all of this? The officer nodded grimly. Yes. And whoever's after it isn't going to stop until they have it. We need your help, Mr. Thompson. We need you to help us find it before they do. George's mind raced, trying to process the implications of what the officer was saying. His father's secret past wasn't just a matter of protecting the family name, it was a matter of life and death. Whoever was chasing this elusive object would stop at nothing to get their hands on it. And now, George was tangled in the web his father had left behind. "I don't know anything about this," George protested, shaking his head. "I don't even know where to start. My father never told me anything about this. I'm just a contractor. A regular guy. I'm not equipped for this kind of thing." "You are the only one who can help us now," the officer said, his voice urgent. "Your father trusted you. That's why we brought you in. You may not understand it yet, but you have a part to play in all of this. Your connection to the syndicate is stronger than you think. And time is running out." George felt a rush of panic, his head spinning as the weight of his situation became clearer. There was no escape. His life had been turned upside down, and the truth about his father's legacy was pulling him deeper into something he couldn't control. The more he learned, the more he realized how little he knew. And with every passing second, the danger grew more real. "We're not the only ones looking for this," the officer added, his voice low. "There are people out there who will do anything to get their hands on what your father left behind. You need to be careful." George's chest tightened as a new, terrifying thought crossed his mind. What if they already knew where it was? What if they were watching him? The officer handed George a small, encrypted device. "This is a secure line. If you decide to help us, contact us through this. But be careful who you trust. There are too many people out there with their own agendas. You can't afford to make mistakes." George stared at the device in his hand, feeling the weight of the choice in front of him. He could walk away, pretend he had nothing to do with any of this, and live the rest of his life in ignorance. But the truth was, the moment his father's secrets had been uncovered, there was no going back. He looked at the officer, his decision settling in. "I'll help. But I need answers. I need to know what I'm walking into. And I need to know what happened to my father." The officer nodded solemnly. "We'll give you what we can. But you need to understand, Mr. Thompson, this is bigger than your father. This is a battle that's been raging for years. And now, it's your turn to fight." The final revelation. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the abandoned warehouse at the outskirts of the city. George stood at the edge of the gravel lot, his heart thundering in his chest. The encrypted device the officer had given him earlier vibrated softly in his pocket, silent confirmation that the authorities were tracking his location. Detective Harris and Special Agent Scott were supposed to be nearby, ready to move in as soon as George signaled. But standing here now, with the weight of his father's hidden past pressing heavily on his shoulders, George knew one thing: he would have to face this moment alone. The coordinates from his father's old map had led him here, to this forsaken place surrounded by rusted fences and wild overgrowth. Whatever secrets his father had left behind, whatever the syndicate was willing to kill for, were hidden inside. The faint echo of gravel crunching under tires broke the silence. George turned to see a convoy of black SUVs rolling toward him, their tinted windows gleaming ominously in the fading light. His stomach clenched as the vehicles came to a halt. The doors opened in unison, and out stepped a group of men in tailored suits, their expressions cold and calculating. At the center of the group was a man George recognized from the photos in the investigation files, Vincent Leclerc, the enigmatic leader of the syndicate. His silver hair gleamed under the fading light, and his piercing blue eyes radiated a chilling confidence. "George Thompson," Leclerc said smoothly as he approached, his voice rich with a European accent. "I must say, you're much braver than I expected. Walking into the lion's den all by yourself? Admirable, but foolish." George clenched his fists, forcing himself to stand tall. "I'm here for answers. Whatever my father left behind, whatever it is you're after, it ends here." Leclerc's lips curled into a cold smile. "Ah, your father. A brilliant man, but far too sentimental for this line of work. He thought he could walk away from us, but no one truly leaves the syndicate." George's jaw tightened. He wasn't like you. Perhaps, Leclerc conceded with a shrug. But he possessed something valuable, something we've spent years searching for. And now, it belongs to you. George's mind raced. He had no idea what Leclerc was talking about. The encrypted files, the strange coordinates, none of it made sense. But he knew one thing: if the syndicate wanted it, it had to be dangerous. I don't have anything, George said firmly. Whatever you think I know, you're wrong. Leclerc's smile faded, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. Let me make this simple, Mr. Thompson. Hand over the artifact your father protected, or I'll bury you right here. Before George could respond, the faint hum of drones filled the air. Red laser dots danced across the gravel as tactical units emerged from the shadows, weapons trained on Leclerc's men. Detective Harris's voice crackled through a hidden speaker. Drop your weapons. You're surrounded. Chaos erupted as Leclerc's men scrambled to draw their guns, but they were quickly subdued by the overwhelming force of the tactical team. Harris and Scott sprinted toward George, their expressions tense. Are you okay? Harris asked breathlessly. George nodded, though his pulse was still racing. I'm fine. But I still don't know what they're after. Scott stepped forward, holding a tablet that displayed the decrypted files from George's father's records. We think we've figured it out, he said. Your father didn't just walk away from the syndicate, he sabotaged their entire operation. He hid a device that contains critical data on their global network. Bank accounts, safe houses, transaction records, it's all there. And they need it to stay in power. George's breath caught in his throat. And you think I have it? Scott shook his head. Not exactly. But your father left clues leading to its location. We believe he trusted only you to find it. George's mind reeled. His father's cryptic messages, the hidden coordinates, it all made sense now. The burden his father had carried was now his to bear. Leclerc, now restrained by the tactical team, sneered at George. You think this is over? He spat. You'll never be free of us. We always find a way. George met Leclerc's gaze, a newfound determination burning in his eyes. Maybe. But not today. With Leclerc and his men in custody, the immediate danger had passed, but George knew his journey was far from over. The device his father had hidden was still out there, and finding it was the only way to ensure the syndicate's defeat. As the tactical team secured the scene, Harris placed a hand on George's shoulder. You did good, Thompson. Your father would be proud. George's throat tightened. I just want this to be over. Scott nodded solemnly. We'll help you finish this. Together. Epilogue, a new legacy. Weeks later, George stood on the porch of his family's old farmhouse, the place where so many of his childhood memories had been made. The field stretched out before him, golden under the afternoon sun. The chaos of the past few months had finally begun to fade, though the weight of his father's secrets still lingered. In his hand, he held a small, weathered journal, his father's final message to him. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, and coordinates that led to the device hidden deep in the mountains. George knew the journey to recover it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. His father had spent his life protecting the world from darkness. Now, it was George's turn to carry that torch. As he closed the journal and looked out at the horizon, a sense of peace washed over him. He wasn't just his father's son anymore, he was a man forging his own path, a path built on truth, courage, and redemption. And no matter what came next, he knew one thing for certain: he would never stop fighting for what was right.